Have you ever wondered why the books of the Bible are arranged like they are? Why there are 4 Gospels and not 3 or 7? Why there are 2 parts to the Bible and how they connect? Or what is the overarching purpose of each of the books in their canonical setting? All of these questions can be answered by looking at the structure of the Bible as a whole. All good books, of course, have a beginning. And with what other words does the Bible begin with but in the beginning? Genesis forms the foundation for everything that will follow in the Bible. It presents an account of creation, the fall of Adam and Eve, and God's plan of redemption through Seth, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But when we look at the rest of the Old Testament, we should note something else. The arrangement of the books in our modern Bibles is different than that of Jewish Bibles, and different than the Bible that Jesus would have read from. In Luke 24:44, Jesus states that, "These are my words to you while I was still with you, that it is necessary to fulfill everything that was written in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms regarding me." Here, Jesus articulates the 3 major divisions within the Jewish Bible: the law, or the books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings, commonly known as the Psalms because Psalms is the first book of this section. Now the 3 sections have 3 different roles. The law, Exodus through Deuteronomy following Genesis, contains stories of the birth, the life, the ministry, the miracles, the teachings, and the death of Moses, the covenant mediator. Does that language sound like 4 other books? Well, it ought to. It is interesting that in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 5, Paul speaks about the Israelites being baptized into Moses through the Red Sea crossing, and in the New Testament we are spoken of as being baptized into Christ. But we get ahead of ourselves. Just remember, none of these things are coincidences. We move from the books of Moses in the Old Testament into what we would typically refer to as history books. But within the Jewish structure, they are part of the prophetic writings. The prophetic writings in the Hebrew Bible do essentially one thing. They prove that God has been faithful to His covenant, even though the people themselves have been unfaithful to Him. Kind of sad, actually, but it is the story of living in a fallen world. The prophets are divided into 2 categories, former and latter. The former prophets are historical books that illustrate the faithfulness of God and the, unfaithfulness of us as people. The latter prophets are actually in the form of covenant lawsuits, with God chastising the people, challenging them to live faithfully, and bringing judgment as well as a clear promise of a Redeemer to come. The third portion, called the Writings, contains some surprising books, like Ruth and Daniel. This section deals with living out life as a believer, especially when you are in exile. So we have the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, but we are missing one book, Chronicles. Chronicles begins its history with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and summarizes history all the way up to the promise of King Cyrus to restore the people back to the land and rebuild the temple. For the Hebrew Bible, it is a good closing summary. But as Christians, the promise of Cyrus is not the end, for Christ has yet to come. Instead, Chronicles forms a kind of bridge that leads us from the Old Testament, a distinctly Jewish book, to the New Testament, a distinctly Christian book. So what do we find when we come to the New Testament? Is there parity between the structures? Yes, there is, and once again we find 3 parts. Like the books of Moses, the first part contains 4 books about the birth, life, ministry, miracles, teachings, and death, but this time of a greater covenant mediator. Why greater? First, Jesus is God, and the deliverance that Jesus brings is greater than that of the deliverance from the bonds of slavery to a wicked king. But Jesus delivers us from the bonds of sin and of death and the influence of the prince of wickedness, Satan himself. As a mediator, at Moses' death, God took him and buried him alone by himself. At Jesus' death, God testified that Jesus was the greater mediator by raising him from the dead. What follows the Gospel accounts is a historical book, as well as the writings of the Apostle Paul. Like the former and the latter prophets, these writers provide both a historical account and covenantal statements about the faithfulness of God in spite of the unfaithfulness of his people. Things don't ever seem to change. Like the former prophets in the Old Testament, which tell the story of the people being established in the land, and eventually God dispersing the people into all of the world, the book of Acts tells the story of the church being established in Jerusalem, and again moving into the whole of the known world. Likewise, the writings of Paul are typically aimed at correcting the churches that have been established, but who had strayed amidst false teachings. Yet, in the midst of all of that, God had proved himself to be faithful. The New Testament concludes with what are typically referred to as the Catholic, the General, or the Universal Epistles. Not surprisingly, they begin with Hebrews, a book which not only interprets much of the Old Testament for us, but more importantly is focused on the worship of God's people, much like the book of Psalms does in the Old Testament. It should not be surprising that Hebrews contains many allusions to and quotations from the book of Psalms within its text. The rest of the Catholic epistles contain practical advice for living out one's faith, particularly in the context of being outside of the land. Both James and Peter begin by addressing the church in the dispersion, a reference to the Old Testament dispersion of the Jews from the land. In addition, Peter speaks of the promised land and to come that is in heaven, reflecting the anticipation that those in the dispersion had for a return to their land. And every good book must have a conclusion. Yet Revelation is much more than just a concluding book. As Chronicles begins with paradise, Revelation ends with paradise restored. As Chronicles moves through redemptive history, so too does Revelation. And while Chronicles ends with a call for the Redeemer who is yet to come, Revelation ends with a call from that Redeemer to all who would hear his gospel and to who would follow. But there is one more thing that a good book has, at least between its major parts, and that is something that connects the two parts together. Kind of a hook that says, "To be continued." Chronicles ends with Cyrus, the king of Persia, making a proclamation that God had called him to build a house for God in Jerusalem. The last statement is, "Let him go up," a statement that has messianic connotations. The book of Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, gives the lineage of the one who will go up and who will build that temple, a temple in his own body. The Bible is a book that contains truth for all of life, but sometimes seeing the overarching structure of the book helps us to see and to understand the unity of the message from Genesis to Revelation, a message that points us to Jesus Christ alone.